I sat by the swinging kitchen doors at table 14, watching my mother tap her champagne glass. She pointed straight at me in front of 200 wealthy guests and laughed into the microphone. She told the entire room that I might be 35 and unmarried, but I was definitely good for a check. Laughter echoed off the crystal chandeliers. My new sister-in-law smirked from the sweetheart table. My name was not even printed in their gold-foiled wedding program. So I put down my fork, pulled out my phone, and sent a single text to my lawyer that canceled their entire $120,000 wedding right in front of them. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. I am Kiara. I am 35 years old, a certified public accountant, and the owner of a highly successful boutique financial consulting firm in Atlanta. But tonight, I was just the invisible family bank sitting exactly where I was supposed to be. Out of sight and out of mind. The country club was draped in an obnoxious amount of white orchids and imported silk. The catering staff rushed past my chair every few minutes carrying trays of Wagyu beef and butter-poached lobster. Every time the heavy wooden kitchen doors swung open, they bumped against the back of my chair. It was a deliberate seating choice. My mother Brenda had meticulously planned every single detail of this reception, including making sure her only daughter was seated with the distant cousins and random plus ones who barely knew the bride and groom. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water and watched the sweetheart table at the center of the room. My younger brother Jamal sat there radiating false confidence in a custom-tailored tuxedo. At 32, Jamal had perfected the art of looking like a successful tech visionary while never actually holding down a job. He had dropped out of his third master program just 6 months ago, but tonight he was playing the role of a brilliant entrepreneur. Beside him sat his new bride, Chloe. Chloe was 29, a master of performing old money elegance for an audience she desperately wanted to impress. She wore a custom gown flown in from Paris, dripping in seed pearls and delicate lace. Chloe came from a family that acted as though they owned vineyards and summer homes. But my background checks told a very different story. Her parents were drowning in credit card debt and barely keeping up with a second mortgage on a house they could not afford. Yet here they were acting like royalty sipping vintage champagne on a dime they did not earn. I picked up the wedding program resting next to my charger plate. It was thick, expensive cardstock with gold foil lettering. I read through the acknowledgement section, taking in every word. Chloe had written a massive paragraph thanking her parents for their endless support and upper-class values. Then came a glowing tribute to my parents, Calvin and Brenda, thanking them for raising such a king of a man. I kept reading. She thanked her bridesmaids. She thanked the groomsmen. She even included a special little note thanking her golden retriever for being the best boy. I searched the entire page for my name. It was completely omitted. Not a single mention of the sister who was sitting in the back of the room. The sister whose stolen legacy was currently paying for every single flower, every drop of imported champagne, and the very dress on the bride's back. The disrespect was so blatant it almost felt comedic. I did not feel the sting of rejection anymore. That had burned away months ago when I first discovered what my family was truly capable of doing to me. Now I only felt a cold, calculating patience. I watched my father Calvin laughing with Chloe's uncles. He was a man who avoided conflict at all costs, silently complicit in everything his wife did, as long as it kept the peace in his own house. He raised his glass to them, projecting the image of a proud, wealthy patriarch, completely ignoring the fact that his own credit cards had been maxed out months before this wedding was even planned. He looked my way for a fraction of a second before quickly averting his eyes, entirely unwilling to acknowledge my presence in the room. The 12-piece band transitioned into a soft jazz number, signaling the start of the speeches. The room grew quiet as the clinking of silverware faded. My mother Brenda stood up from the head table, adjusting her designer evening gown. She walked to the center of the dance floor, taking the microphone from the best man. She loved an audience. Her entire life revolved around her social standing at our church and projecting an image of flawless excellence to the world. She smiled a warm, practiced smile that reached every corner of the room except mine. She started by welcoming Chloe's family, speaking about how two wonderful lineages were joining together today. She talked about Jamal, describing him as a visionary, a leader, and the absolute pride of our family. She called Chloe the beautiful daughter she had always prayed for. The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. I was her biological daughter sitting right there, but I had never fit her mold. I was too independent, too focused on my business, too resistant to being controlled and manipulated. I had spent my 20s building my firm, studying late into the night while Jamal was handed everything on a silver platter. I bought my first property at 28, while Jamal was still asking for gas money. But in my mother's eyes, my success was just a resource to be harvested, never an achievement to be celebrated. Then my mother turned her body slightly, looking past the sea of tables straight toward the kitchen doors. Her eyes locked onto mine. She raised her champagne flute high. And of course she said, her voice amplifying through the massive speakers, "I want to send a special thank you to Kiara." She paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to ensure everyone was paying attention. She might be 35 and not married, but she is definitely good for a check. The entire ballroom erupted into laughter. 200 guests, including Chloe's snobby relatives and my mother's church friends, threw their heads back and chuckled at my expense. I watched Chloe lean into Jamal, her hand covering her mouth as she smirked at me from the sweetheart table. Jamal just smiled, looking vaguely embarrassed, but completely unwilling to defend me. My mother stood there basking in the laughter, soaking in the validation of her cruel joke. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully put me in my place, reminding me that my only value to this family was financial. She thought I would just sit there and take the humiliation because that is what I had always done in the past. I did not cry. I did not shrink down in my chair or run out of the room in tears like they expected me to. Instead, I calmly picked up my linen napkin and wiped the corners of my mouth. I set my fork down perfectly parallel to my knife. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. I opened my messages and found the thread with Mr. Sterling, my estate and business lawyer. He knew exactly what tonight was. He had been waiting for my signal. I typed 3 simple words: execute order 66. I hit send and slipped the phone back into my bag. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping slightly against the polished floor. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my tailored dress. The laughter in the room was just beginning to die down as people turned back to their meals. No one expected me to move. I stepped away from the kitchen doors and began to walk. The distance from table 14 to the stage felt like miles, but I took my time. My heels clicked against the hardwood floors in a steady, rhythmic beat. I kept my posture completely straight, my expression unreadable. As I passed the center tables, the guests began to notice me. The murmurs started rippling through the crowd. Chloe's smirk faded into a look of confusion. Jamal sat up straighter, his eyes darting between me and our mother. Brenda was still holding the microphone, her triumphant smile slowly dissolving into a mask of pure uncertainty as I approached the stage. I was not the invisible bank anymore. I was the owner of the vault, and I was about to shut the entire operation down right in front of them. As I took that first step toward the stage, the entire room seemed to move in slow motion. The clicking of my heels on the polished wood floor echoed in my ears, serving as a steady countdown to the end of my family's masquerade. To understand how we reached this exact moment of total public destruction, you have to rewind the clock exactly 6 months to a rainy Tuesday afternoon inside the glass walls of my accounting firm. My office was a sanctuary of order and profit. At 35 years old, I had built a financial consulting empire from scratch right in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The phones were ringing nonstop. My junior accountants were moving briskly between cubicles carrying thick client portfolios and tax documents. I was sitting behind my custom oak desk, reviewing a quarterly profit report for a major corporate client. Everything was perfectly structured exactly the way I liked it. Then the glass doors to my suite swung open and my peace was completely shattered. My mother marched into my private office without an appointment, acting like she owned the entire building. Right behind her, trailing like a shadow looking for a place to hide, was my brother Jamal. He was wearing brand new designer sneakers and a distressed hoodie that probably cost more than my first car. He plopped down on my leather guest chair while my mother stood over my desk with her hands resting firmly on her hips. I did not even look up from my spreadsheets. I simply asked what the emergency was that required bypassing my receptionist. My mother did not miss a single beat. She announced that Jamal was officially stepping into his destiny as a tech entrepreneur, and he needed seed money. I set my pen down and looked directly at my brother. I asked him what happened to the supply chain management master program he had begged our parents to co-sign a loan for just 8 months ago. Jamal looked at the ceiling and muttered that the academic curriculum was too restrictive for a true visionary. That was his third dropped master program in 4 years. My mother slammed her heavy designer purse onto my desk, demanding my full attention. She said Jamal had an idea for a mobile application that was going to change the entire beauty industry, and he needed $50,000 to get it off the ground. She did not ask me if I could help him. She did not pitch a business model or a strategy. She just gave me a number and fully expected me to open my checkbook on command. I asked Jamal what exactly this application did. He mumbled a few empty buzzwords about synergy and blockchain integration in the cosmetic space. He had no business plan. He had no market research. He did not even have a basic wireframe drawn on a napkin. He just had a vague concept and a massive sense of entitlement, assuming I would blindly fund his delusion. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and told him absolutely not. I told him my firm was a legitimate financial institution, not a charity, and I was definitely not an angel investor for people who quit every single time life required actual effort. That was when my mother deployed her absolute favorite weapon against me, the ultimate guilt trip. She leaned over my desk, pointing a perfectly manicured finger right at my face. She lowered her voice into that harsh, scolding tone she used whenever I stepped out of her designated lines. She told me I was being selfish and arrogant. She said black women need to uplift black men, especially in a society that is constantly designed to tear them down. She told me I had more money than I knew what to do with, and it was my fundamental duty as a sister to ensure my brother could sit on a throne of his own making. I stared right back at her, completely unfazed by the theatrics. I told her that uplifting someone meant holding them accountable, not funding their chronic laziness. I reminded her that while I was studying late into the night, eating cheap noodles and taking the city bus to build my business, she was busy buying Jamal a new car, just so he would not feel bad about failing his undergraduate final exams. I told her that the so-called black tax does not mean I have to go bankrupt financing a 32-year-old man who absolutely refuses to work a regular 9-to-5 job. Jamal shrank down in his leather chair, looking thoroughly embarrassed, but saying absolutely nothing to defend himself or me. He just sat there and let our mother fight his battle for him. My mother grabbed her purse, her face tight with fury. She told me that I might have a fancy corner office and a lot of money in the bank, but I was poor in spirit. She said family is supposed to mean everything, and my refusal to help my own flesh and blood would surely curse my business. I stood up and opened my office door to show them out. I calmly told her my business was blessed because I actually worked for it instead of begging for handouts. As she stormed past me into the hallway, she promised I would deeply regret turning my back on my own family. She put her arm around Jamal, telling him not to worry, and assuring him they would find the money somehow, because he deserved the entire world. I closed the door behind them, took a deep breath, and returned to my profit margins. After they left, I immediately called my business partner, Aisha, into my office. Aisha had been with me since the very beginning of my firm. She was fiercely protective, incredibly sharp, and practically an older sister to me. She walked in carrying a fresh cup of coffee, taking one look at my face, and knowing exactly who had just ruined my afternoon focus. I recounted the entire exhausting conversation, detailing the ridiculous app idea and the heavy-handed guilt trip about uplifting the men in our family. Aisha sat on the edge of my desk, shaking her head in disbelief. She warned me right then and there to be careful. She said Brenda was not the type of woman to just take no for an answer. Aisha knew my mother well enough to recognize that a denied request was just a temporary roadblock that my mother would actively scheme to bypass. She told me to lock down my personal accounts and change all my banking passwords immediately. I actually laughed it off at the time, telling Aisha she was being overly paranoid. I told her my mother might be manipulative and far too obsessed with keeping up appearances for her church friends, but she was still a woman who respected the law. I genuinely believed my refusal was the final word on the matter. I was highly confident in the boundary I had established, firmly believing that my assets were perfectly safe and that Jamal would simply move on to his next fleeting obsession once the $50,000 failed to materialize. I believed my absolute refusal had effectively killed his grand entrepreneurial plans. What I did not know was that my mother had already formulated a secondary strategy to secure Jamal's elevated status in the world. If she could not buy his way into becoming a tech chief executive, she would make sure he married his way into what looked like high society. She just needed to find the right naive girl with the right aesthetic to fall for his carefully curated charm. Exactly 3 weeks after the incident in my office, my mother summoned the entire family for a mandatory Sunday dinner. I arrived at my parents' suburban home carrying a bottle of expensive wine, expecting another passive-aggressive lecture about family loyalty. Instead, I walked into the dining room and found Jamal holding court. Sitting right next to him, radiating an absurd amount of performative elegance, was Chloe. She was wearing a beige cashmere sweater draped over her shoulders, like she had just stepped off a yacht in Nantucket. Jamal introduced her as his fiancée. I almost dropped the wine bottle right there on the foyer rug. My brother, who had no job, no car in his own name, and a credit score that was practically non-existent, had somehow managed to secure a fiancé in less than a month. But the real shock came when Chloe proudly extended her left hand to show off the ring. It was a massive radiant cut diamond set in a platinum halo band. As a certified public accountant, my brain automatically calculated the retail value. That ring was easily sitting at the $25,000 mark. I looked at Jamal, trying to decipher how a man who had just begged me for seed money could suddenly finance a luxury diamond. He deliberately avoided my gaze, taking a long sip of his sweet tea. Then I looked at my mother, who was practically vibrating with pride, and I instantly knew the truth. Brenda had co-signed a massive high-interest loan just to keep up this charade. As we sat down for dinner, Chloe immediately took over the conversation. She spoke with this breathless, practiced cadence, constantly dropping subtle hints about her family lineage. She casually mentioned her parents summering on the coast, and her grandfather having historic ties to elite equestrian clubs. She used words like pedigree and classic aesthetics, making sure everyone at the table knew she came from a long line of refined traditional wealth. She told my mother how much she adored our family, because we possessed that rare entrepreneurial spirit, pointing a perfectly manicured finger right at Jamal. She actually called him a tech visionary, completely oblivious to the fact that his so-called tech empire consisted of an unwritten application and 3 dropped college degrees. My mother was eating it up. Brenda hung on every single word Chloe said, nodding enthusiastically and constantly refilling her wine glass. My mother saw Chloe not as a person, but as a high-value status symbol. A beautiful white daughter-in-law with supposedly deep pockets and old money connections was exactly the kind of social currency Brenda craved to show off to her church circle. It was the ultimate aesthetic upgrade for the family image. I sat quietly at the end of the table, cutting my chicken and listening to the grand illusions floating around the dining room. My father Calvin sat across from me, silent as usual, chewing his food and letting the women run the narrative. When Chloe started boasting about her parents' sprawling estate in the countryside, I decided I had heard enough fairy tales for one evening. I slipped my phone out of my pocket, keeping it hidden beneath the heavy linen tablecloth. In my line of work, I have access to comprehensive public record databases to vet potential corporate clients. I typed in the names of Chloe's parents and her hometown. The search results loaded in less than 30 seconds. I took a slow sip of my water as I scrolled through the harsh financial reality of my future in-laws. Chloe's parents did not own a sprawling country estate. They owned a highly leveraged 4-bedroom house that currently had a massive second mortgage attached to it. They had multiple tax liens filed against them over the past 5 years. Their credit utilization was maxed out across several premium cards. They were not old money. They were heavily indebted performers, living a champagne lifestyle on a tap water budget. They were drowning in the exact same financial desperation that my mother was trying to hide. I slid my phone back into my pocket, choosing to keep that explosive information to myself for the time being. If Jamal wanted to marry a financial mirage, that was his problem to deal with. But then the conversation shifted to the wedding plans, and I quickly realized this was going to become my problem very quickly. Chloe pulled out her sleek tablet and opened a highly curated digital vision board. She announced that because her family had a certain high standard to uphold, the wedding had to be an absolute masterpiece. She started listing off her demands like she was reading a royal decree. She wanted a historic country club venue. She required imported white orchids cascading from the ceiling to create a botanical canopy. She demanded a 12-piece live band, a custom designer gown from a specific boutique in Paris, and a 5-course plated dinner featuring Wagyu beef. She told my mother that her relatives were accustomed to absolute luxury, and she absolutely could not embarrass them with a budget wedding. The total estimated cost, she casually dropped onto the dinner table, was a staggering $120,000. I actually choked on my drink, coughing into my napkin. I looked at my mother, fully expecting Brenda to shut this ridiculous nonsense down immediately. $120,000 was an astronomical amount of money for a family that was already stretching their credit limits just to maintain a basic suburban lifestyle. But Brenda did not flinch. Instead, my mother reached across the table and grasped Chloe's hands with tears welling in her eyes. She promised Chloe right then and there that she would have the wedding of her wildest dreams. She swore the family would spare absolutely no expense to ensure the day was flawless, and that Chloe's relatives would be absolutely blown away by our standard of excellence. I stared at my mother in absolute disbelief. Calvin shifted uncomfortably in his seat, staring down at his plate, because he knew perfectly well his bank accounts could not support even a fraction of those promises. Jamal just sat, looking smug and triumphant, playing the role of the wealthy groom, providing for his demanding bride. He had found a woman whose obsession with appearances perfectly matched our mother's toxic need for status. It was a match made in financial hell. Chloe even had the nerve to look down the table at me, offering a condescending smile as she suggested that my small accounting business could probably handle tracking the vendor RSVPs since I was good with spreadsheets. As dinner wrapped up and dishes were being cleared, I pulled Jamal aside in the hallway while Chloe was showing my mother more venue pictures in the living room. I asked him point blank how he planned to pay for a $25,000 ring and a 6-figure wedding without a single source of income. He flashed me his signature arrogant smile, smoothing the lapels of his jacket. He told me not to worry about it because our mother had everything totally under control. He said the family was finally stepping up to support his future the way they always should have, and that I should try to be happy for him instead of acting like a bitter single woman. I left the house that night with a terrible sinking feeling in my chest. My mother had just committed to a massive financial obligation to impress a family of broke pretenders. Jamal was playing a highly dangerous game of fake it until you make it, banking entirely on our parents' credit. As I sat in my car gripping the leather steering wheel, I realized exactly why Brenda had been so incredibly calm about the massive cost. She did not plan on paying for a single dime of it herself. She had just sold Chloe a $120,000 dream, and she fully intended to make me foot the bill. It took exactly 14 days for the financial house of cards my mother built to completely collapse. The catalyst was the initial deposit for the historic country club Chloe had so righteously demanded. Securing the botanical gardens and the grand ballroom for a Saturday evening in peak wedding season required an immediate payment of $30,000. I knew the deadline was approaching because Chloe had been posting nonstop on social media about securing her dream venue, complete with champagne toast emojis and hashtags about generational wealth. I also knew with absolute certainty that my father did not have $30,000 in liquid assets to his name. The inevitable explosion happened on a Thursday morning. I was in the middle of a conference call with a corporate tax client when my office door flew open. It hit the wall with a loud thud that made my client pause mid-sentence. I held up a finger to signal my mother to wait, apologizing to my client, and swiftly ending the call. Brenda did not even have the decency to look embarrassed about interrupting my actual source of income. Her face was flushed tight with a mixture of profound panic and aggressive entitlement. She locked the glass door behind her, pulled the blinds shut, and marched directly up to my desk. She slammed a manila folder down right on top of my tax spreadsheets. She was breathing heavily, gripping the edge of my oak desk with white knuckles. She told me we had a massive family emergency, and I needed to initiate a wire transfer immediately. I calmly folded my hands together, resting them on my desk, and asked her to clarify the emergency. I fully expected her to mention a medical bill or a sudden repair for their suburban home. Instead, she opened the folder and slid a country club invoice toward me. The total amount due immediately was $30,000. Brenda looked me dead in the eye and said my father had tried to put the deposit on his American Express card that morning, but the transaction was flagged and flatly declined. She described the absolute humiliation of sitting in the plush office of the country club event coordinator, handing over a premium credit card only, to have it handed right back with a sympathetic smile and a request for an alternate form of payment. My mother said she had to lie and tell the coordinator that the bank had put a fraud alert on the card due to the large amount. She promised them the wire transfer would clear by the end of the business day. I looked at the invoice, then looked back at my mother. I asked her why she was bringing my father's declined credit card issues to my office. Brenda slammed her hand on the desk again. She raised her voice, telling me to stop playing games and act like a supportive daughter. She demanded that I log into my banking portal and wire the $30,000 to the venue immediately to save the family from public embarrassment. She actually had the audacity to call it a temporary bridge loan, claiming Jamal would pay me back with interest the very second his cosmetic application received its venture capital funding. I sat back in my chair, letting the absolute delusion of her request wash over me. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life minimizing my accomplishments, now demanding the fruits of my labor to finance a fantasy. I kept my voice incredibly low and steady. I told her that I was not a bank. I told her my firm's revenue account was designated for payroll, for commercial lease payments, and for corporate taxes. It was absolutely not a personal slush fund for her to dip into whenever she made promises she could not afford to keep. Brenda paced the length of my office, waving her hands in the air. She started shouting about family legacy and the importance of optics. She said Chloe's family was watching our every move. She insisted that if we lost this venue, Chloe's parents would realize we did not have the generational wealth Jamal had implicitly promised them. She told me that I was actively choosing to ruin my brother's life over a sum of money that I could easily earn back in a few months. She tried to weaponize my success against me, stating that since I was an unmarried woman with no children, I had absolutely no real expenses to worry about anyway. I stood up and leaned across my desk, closing the distance between us. I told her I would not authorize a wire transfer for 30 cents, let alone $30,000 to fund a wedding based entirely on a lie. I reminded her that Jamal was 32 years old and fully capable of working to pay for his own wedding. If Chloe wanted imported orchids and Wagyu beef, then Jamal needed to get a job to pay for them. I told her that if they wanted to avoid humiliation at the country club, the solution was simple. They needed to call the coordinator, cancel the reservation, and plan a wedding they could actually afford. My mother stared at me with pure venom in her eyes. The mask of the loving, desperate parent completely dissolved, revealing the toxic entitlement beneath. She pointed her finger at my chest and told me I was the most selfish, bitter woman she had ever met. She said my business success had turned me into a cold corporate robot who cared more about profit margins than her own flesh and blood. She accused me of being jealous of Chloe because Jamal had found love while I was destined to die alone with my spreadsheets. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply walked over to the door, opened it, and stood aside. I told her the consultation was over, and she needed to leave my office before I had security escort her out. Brenda snatched the invoice off my desk, her face contorted with rage. As she marched out into the hallway, she turned back to deliver one final threat. She told me that family loyalty was everything, and that God would surely punish me for turning my back on my brother in his hour of need. She muttered curses under her breath, swearing that she would find a way to pay for the wedding, and that I would deeply regret disrespecting her authority. I watched her stomp toward the elevators, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the floor. I closed my door, feeling a slight tremor in my hands from the adrenaline, but an overwhelming sense of clarity in my mind. I had drawn a hard line in the sand, and I had defended it. I genuinely believed that my firm refusal had finally cornered her. I thought the declined credit card and my closed checkbook would force them to cancel the luxury venue and face reality. I assumed she would have to go back to Chloe and explain that the royal wedding was officially downgraded. I was wrong. I underestimated the sheer desperation of a woman obsessed with social status. My mother had no intention of scaling back the wedding or admitting financial defeat to her future daughter-in-law. When she walked out of my office muttering about finding a way to pay for it, she meant it literally. If she could not bully me into opening my business accounts, she would simply bypass me and find another vault to crack. I had successfully protected the money I earned, but I had completely forgotten to guard the money that was waiting for me. It was a rainy Sunday evening when my false sense of security completely shattered. I was sitting at the massive marble island in my downtown penthouse, sipping a glass of Cabernet and running my routine quarterly financial reconciliations. As a certified public accountant, auditing is practically encoded into my DNA. I review every single personal and business account every single quarter with zero exceptions. That strict protocol included the legacy trust. My grandmother, who we all respectfully called Big Mama, was an absolute force of nature. She worked 3 separate jobs, scrubbing floors and taking in laundry, so she could buy commercial property in developing neighborhoods long before gentrification ever hit our city. She pinched every single penny until it screamed. Before she passed away, she set up a generational wealth fund specifically designed to break the cycle of poverty in our family. The money was explicitly designated for purchasing real estate funding, higher education, or securing business capital. It was holy money meant to build a legacy, not to fund a party. I was designated as the primary managing trustee when I turned 25, but because of how the original legal paperwork was structured, my mother remained listed as a secondary co-signer on the account. I never bothered to have Brenda legally removed because despite her being heavily obsessed with status and church politics, I never imagined she would actually steal from her own mother's blood, sweat, and tears. I assumed that sacred money was untouchable. I was incredibly naive. I opened my secure banking portal, entering my 2-factor authentication code, and navigated directly to the Legacy Trust dashboard. I was expecting to see the solid, healthy balance I had confirmed last quarter, supplemented by the standard interest yields. Instead, the screen loaded, and my blood ran absolutely cold. The numbers staring back at me were completely wrong. The balance was severely depleted. My heart started pounding aggressively against my ribs as I quickly scrolled down to the transaction history. I felt a physical wave of nausea wash over my entire body. Right at the top of the ledger was a cleared transfer for $30,000. The recipient name was Oak Grove Historic Country Club. It was the exact luxury venue Chloe had demanded, the exact amount Brenda had marched into my office begging for just 2 weeks ago. My mother had not scaled back the wedding plans at all. She had simply bypassed my firm's bank account and found a different vault to crack. My hands began to visibly shake as I scrolled further down the glowing screen. The financial bleed did not stop at the venue deposit. It was a full-scale hemorrhage of our family's generational wealth. There was a pending wire transfer for $15,000 to a vendor called Botanical Elegance. That was clearly the payment for Chloe's ridiculous cascading white orchids. 2 days before that transaction, an international wire transfer for $10,000 had been fully processed and sent to Maison de Blanc, a high-end bridal boutique in Paris. That was the custom designer gown. My grandmother's hard-earned real estate money. The money she literally scrubbed floors to accumulate was being aggressively liquidated to finance a fake Instagram aesthetic for a white woman who did not even want me in her bridal suite. I sat in my quiet kitchen staring at the illuminated screen while the sheer magnitude of the betrayal settled deep into my bones. This was not just a desperate mother borrowing a few $100s to cover groceries. This was systematic, calculated grand theft. But as the initial shock began to slowly wear off, my analytical mind immediately took over the situation. The Legacy Trust had strict operational safeguards in place. Big Mama was no fool when she drafted those documents. Any withdrawal exceeding $5,000 required a dual authorization mandate, meaning both Brenda and I had to physically or electronically sign the release forms to move the capital. I clicked into the bank's document viewer to pull up the authorization forms for the recent transfers. I needed to see exactly how she had bypassed the heavy security protocols. The digital documents loaded on my screen, and I felt a dangerous, quiet rage ignite inside my chest. On the signature line right next to my mother's extravagant cursive loops was my own signature. It was a nearly perfect forgery, but as the professional who signs hundreds of official tax documents a year, I could easily spot the subtle hesitations in the pen strokes. The loop on the first letter was slightly too wide, and the angle of the ending was completely wrong. Brenda had forged my signature. She had committed federal wire fraud and grand larceny against her own daughter just to pay for a party she could not afford. I closed my laptop and pushed it away, taking a deep, steady breath to calm my racing heart. The level of criminality was absolutely staggering. My mother had completely lost her mind. She was so blinded by the toxic need to project an image of old money to Chloe's heavily indebted family that she was willing to risk a federal prison sentence to do it. She traded her freedom, her integrity, and our entire relationship for Wagyu beef and imported flowers. I did not scream out loud. I did not throw my wine glass against the pristine kitchen wall. I did not pick up my phone to call her and demand immediate answers. Crying and screaming is exactly what victims do, and I was absolutely not a victim. I was a highly trained financial investigator who had just been handed a loaded weapon. I realized in that precise moment that my family did not view me as a human being with feelings or boundaries. They viewed me as an obstacle standing between them and the luxury lifestyle they felt completely entitled to. To Brenda and Jamal, I was just the annoying gatekeeper of their unearned wealth. I opened my laptop back up and started downloading every single bank statement, every forged authorization form, and every wire transfer receipt. I created a secure encrypted folder on my local drive and began meticulously compiling the evidence against my own mother. I tracked every single penny that had been stolen from the trust. The total unauthorized withdrawals amounted to $55,000 in less than 14 days. Brenda was draining the account at a terrifying speed. If I confronted her right now, she would undoubtedly panic play the victim and immediately start hiding her tracks or manipulating my father Calvin into taking the fall for her crimes. She would run straight to her church friends and spin a tearful narrative about how her successful wealthy daughter was trying to ruin her only brother's beautiful union over a simple family loan. I knew I had to be much smarter than that. I could not just react on emotion. I had to completely dismantle her entire operation. I needed to let her think she had successfully gotten away with the theft. I needed to let Chloe continue planning her absolute dream wedding without any interruptions. I needed them all to get so deeply invested in this grand illusion that the eventual crash would be totally catastrophic and financially impossible to recover from. I spent the next 3 hours poring over the vendor contracts that my mother had blindly uploaded into the bank's portal to justify the massive wire transfers. And as I read through the fine print of the country club agreement, the florist invoice, and the catering deposit, a brilliant, flawless strategy began to form in my mind. Brenda was not a meticulous woman. She was sloppy and arrogant. In her desperate rush to secure these luxury vendors using the stolen trust funds, she had made a fatal administrative error. She had paid the deposits directly from the trust account using the forged documents, but the contracts themselves required the primary financier to be the official client on record. Since the money was legally sourced from the trust, and my name was listed as the primary trustee, I had the ultimate legal authority over every single one of those vendor accounts. She had basically handed me the remote control to the entire wedding. I did not just have the power to stop the bleeding. I had the power to detonate the entire event from the inside out. I just had to wait for the absolute perfect moment to push the button. The very next morning, my plan to stay entirely silent hit a massive brick wall. I was sitting in my office at 7 in the morning nursing a black coffee and reviewing the deeper banking structures of the Legacy Trust. I had already identified the $55,000 in stolen cash, but my instincts as an auditor told me to look at the attached collateral accounts. Big Mama had left us 3 commercial properties in rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods. They were the crown jewels of the trust, generating steady rental income that was supposed to fund our generational wealth. I pulled up the property deeds and the attached equity lines. My screen refreshed, and the coffee in my mouth suddenly tasted like battery acid. Brenda had not just drained the liquid cash. She had gone to a secondary lending institution and used the commercial properties as collateral to open a massive line of credit. The total approved amount was $150,000. She had leveraged my grandmother's actual brick-and-mortar legacy to ensure Chloe got her imported white orchids and a custom gown. And right there on the digital loan agreement authorized just 3 days prior was another flawless forgery of my signature. The cash withdrawals were a serious problem, but leveraging the real estate was a catastrophic threat. If Brenda defaulted on that line of credit, the bank could seize the commercial properties Big Mama had literally scrubbed floors to buy. I realized I could not just sit back and play a totally passive game of chess anymore. I had to look my mother in the eye and see exactly how far her delusion had spread. I needed to know if there was even a shred of remorse left in her heart before I took the actions I was preparing to take. I grabbed my keys, drove straight out to the suburbs, and pulled into the driveway of my parents' pristine 4-bedroom home. The lawn was perfectly manicured. The luxury cars were parked out front. It was the ultimate picture of upper-middle-class success, built entirely on a foundation of financial quicksand. I unlocked the front door and walked straight into the living room. My father, Calvin, was sitting in his usual brown leather recliner watching a sports highlight reel on the flat-screen television. My mother was sitting on the plush sectional sofa, surrounded by thick, glossy bridal magazines and fabric swatches. She was holding a magnifying glass over a sample of imported lace, looking as peaceful as a woman who had not just committed federal fraud. I did not yell. I did not throw my bag down. I calmly walked over to the glass coffee table and dropped a printed stack of the forged loan documents right on top of her bridal magazines. I asked her if she really thought she could leverage Big Mama's commercial properties for a $150,000 line of credit without me receiving an automated alert from the title company. Brenda did not flinch. She did not drop her fabric swatch. She simply looked down at the highlighted bank papers and then looked up at me with a completely unbothered expression. She let out a long, exasperated sigh like I was a stubborn teenager interrupting her favorite television show. She carefully set her magnifying glass down and smoothed the front of her expensive blouse. She looked me dead in the eye and said it was family money. She said the word family like it was a magic spell that instantly erased the legal definition of grand larceny. She told me I was being incredibly dramatic over a simple line of credit that was heavily necessary for the survival of our social standing. I asked her how leveraging commercial real estate to buy Wagyu beef and a 12-piece band equated to family survival. Brenda raised her voice, dropping her calm facade. She pointed her finger at me and demanded I lower my tone in her house. She said Chloe's people came from a long line of wealth and prestige. She insisted that if we did not throw an event that matched their high society expectations, they would look down on Jamal, and by extension, they would look down on our entire family. She claimed she was protecting our legacy by showing Chloe's relatives that we had undeniable class and sophistication. I stared at her, completely astounded by the sheer magnitude of her mental gymnastics. I reminded her that Chloe's family did not have a dime to their name. I told her they were drowning in a second mortgage and maxed-out credit cards, and that she was stealing from her own mother's trust fund to impress a bunch of broke pretenders. My mother scoffed, waving her hand in the air like my facts were just annoying mosquitoes. She said I simply did not understand how the real world operated because I spent all my time hiding behind spreadsheets. Then she delivered the ultimate insult. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unfiltered pity. She said I was 35 years old, single, and sitting on a pile of money I clearly did not know how to enjoy. She asked me what I possibly needed the trust fund for, since I had no husband to support and no children to pass it down to. She told me I could easily make the money back with my accounting firm. She actually smiled a cold, patronizing smile and said, I should be grateful that my hard work was finally being put to good use by helping my brother secure a beautiful wife. She framed her felony forgery as a favor to me, claiming she was giving my lonely life some actual purpose. I slowly turned my head and looked at my father. Calvin had not moved a single muscle since I walked into the room. He sat in his leather recliner, gripping the armrests tightly. He was staring straight ahead at the television screen, acting like the escalating confrontation happening 3 feet away from him was a completely invisible event. I asked him if he had anything to say about his wife committing federal fraud to finance a party they could not afford. My father did not even look at me. He simply reached for the remote control and turned the volume up on the television. That small, cowardly action told me absolutely everything I needed to know. He was perfectly fine with his daughter being financially exploited, as long as he did not have to deal with the wrath of his wife. He was silently enabling her destruction because it protected his peace and his false image of a perfect suburban life. I looked back at Brenda. She had already picked up her magnifying glass and returned to examining the lace fabric swatches, completely dismissing my presence. She thought she had won. She firmly believed that because she had invoked the sacred concept of family loyalty and weaponized my single status against me, I would just swallow my pride and accept the financial abuse. She assumed I would do what I had done my entire childhood, which was back down, keep the peace, and let Jamal have whatever he wanted. I stood in the center of their pristine living room and felt the final remaining thread of my familial attachment snap. There was no sadness left. There was no desperate inner child waiting for her parents to finally love her and protect her. There was only a highly successful certified public accountant staring at two deeply toxic liabilities. They did not love me. They loved what my credit score and my work ethic could provide for them. I was nothing more than a vendor in the business of their lives, and they had just committed the ultimate breach of contract. I did not say another word to either of them. I did not threaten to call the police or scream about the injustice of it all. I simply reached down, picked up the forged documents from the coffee table, and placed them back into my leather briefcase. I turned around and walked out of the house. I did not slam the front door. I closed it quietly, locking them inside their beautiful, expensive delusion. As I walked down the driveway toward my car, the cool morning air hit my face and my mind immediately shifted from anger to absolute tactical precision. Brenda thought the line of credit was her ultimate victory, but she had fundamentally misunderstood how financial liability works. By tying my name to those luxury vendor contracts, using the stolen trust funds, she had inadvertently given me total legal authority over every single aspect of Jamal and Chloe's fairy tale wedding. I slid into the driver's seat of my car, started the engine, and smiled. It was time to stop arguing with thieves and start legally dismantling the entire operation. I pulled out of my parents' driveway and merged onto the main road. The silence inside my car was eerie, but it was the exact kind of silence I needed. Most people would have immediately called the bank to freeze the accounts. Most people would have called the police to report the fraud right then and there. But I am an auditor. I know that if you freeze an account prematurely, the rat simply scurries back into the walls and finds another way to chew through your foundation. If I froze the credit line today, Brenda would immediately run to our church congregation, crying about how her successful but heartless daughter was trying to ruin her only brother's beautiful wedding over a simple misunderstanding. She would spin a narrative of persecution, and my father would silently nod along to protect his own peace. I refused to give her the opportunity to play the victim. I needed her to feel completely secure, so she would keep walking blindly into the trap she built for herself. I synced my phone to my car audio system and called Aisha. She picked up on the second ring. I gave her a flat, clinical rundown of what I had just discovered and how my mother had reacted in the living room. Aisha let out a long breath and told me she was ready to drive out to the suburbs and handle my mother herself. I smiled at her fierce loyalty but told her to stand down. I explained my strategy. I told Aisha I needed her to pull the vendor identification numbers from the trust ledger and start matching them to corporate contact sheets. Aisha caught on immediately. She laughed a sharp, knowing laugh and told me I was absolutely terrifying when I was calculating. She promised to have the vendor profiles on my desk by the time I reached the office. Next, I called Mr. Sterling. He is a 62-year-old estate lawyer who does not mince words, and he had been managing Big Mama's legal affairs since I was a teenager. When I explained the forged line of credit and the unauthorized commercial property leverage, he was dead silent for a moment. Then he asked me if I wanted to file a police report for grand larceny. I told him we would definitely get there, but right now I needed a different kind of legal maneuver. I explained that Brenda had used the forged line of credit to pay the massive deposits for a luxury country club, a celebrity florist, and a high-end bridal boutique in Paris. I asked Mr. Sterling a very specific question. Since those vendor deposits were paid directly from a trust account, where I am the primary legal trustee, and the collateral used was commercial real estate, solely deeded in my name, did that not make me the primary financial stakeholder of those contracts? Mr. Sterling let out a low whistle. He confirmed my theory. Because the funds were sourced from my assets and deployed via a fraudulent instrument, I had the absolute legal right to step in and assume total control of those vendor agreements to protect my financial interests. My mother had effectively purchased the wedding using my corporate identity. That meant I was not just a guest. I was the client. By the time I walked back into my downtown office, Aisha had the contact files printed and highlighted on my desk. I sat down and made the first call to the Oak Grove Historic Country Club. I bypassed the standard event coordinators and requested to speak directly to the director of finance. I introduced myself and provided the routing numbers from the $30,000 wire transfer they had received. I calmly explained that there had been a slight administrative oversight during the booking process. I informed the director that the funds originated from my corporate trust, and as the primary financier, the contract needed to be updated to reflect my name as the sole authorized client on the account. I had Mr. Sterling fax over a certified letter of financial authorization to back up my claim. The country club director, eager to secure the remaining $90,000 for the luxury event, complied immediately. Within 20 minutes, the venue contract was completely rewritten. Brenda was removed as the primary contact. Chloe was removed as the decision maker. I was now the sole legal owner of the reception space, the catering package, and the open bar. I did the exact same thing with Botanical Elegance. The florist gladly transferred the account into my name once I proved I was the source of the $15,000 deposit. Then I stayed late at the office navigating the time zone difference to call the Parisian bridal boutique. It took a bit of polite persuasion and a translated legal document from Mr. Sterling, but the boutique manager finally updated their ledger. Chloe thought she was getting a custom gown paid for by her wealthy future mother-in-law. Legally speaking, she was wearing a dress owned entirely by me. I sat back in my office chair watching the sun set over the Atlanta skyline. I had spent the entire day quietly restructuring the structural foundation of my brother's wedding. I had not yelled. I had not thrown a single tantrum. I had simply used my education and my resources to execute a flawless corporate takeover of their fairy tale. Brenda and Chloe were currently picking out napkin rings and tasting cake flavors, completely convinced they had successfully scammed their way into high society. They had absolutely no idea that every single contract they signed, every flower they ordered, and the very room they planned to dance in belonged entirely to the woman they had spent my entire life treating like a stepping stone. They thought they were holding all the cards, but I owned the entire casino. I packed up my briefcase, turned off my office lights, and went home to wait for the wedding day. The countdown to Saturday began ticking with a frantic, desperate energy that consumed my entire family. 4 days before the event, my mother practically lived at the country club, pacing the manicured lawns and barking orders at the catering staff like she was born into royalty. I received a text message from Brenda demanding my presence for the final venue walkthrough on Wednesday afternoon. She framed it as a family obligation, but I knew she just wanted an audience to witness her newly acquired high society status. I cleared my afternoon schedule, grabbed my designer tote bag, and drove out to the estate. When I walked through the grand mahogany doors of the country club, the venue coordinator caught my eye immediately. Her name was Sarah. She gave me a very subtle, knowing nod before turning her attention back to my mother and Chloe, who were currently debating the exact placement of the ice sculpture. Sarah knew exactly who was signing her paychecks, but she played her part flawlessly, indulging Chloe's demanding requests with absolute professional grace. The climax of the walkthrough was the grand reveal of the bridal suite. Sarah led us up a sweeping marble staircase and unlocked a set of double doors. The suite was breathtaking. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the 18th-hole plush velvet seating areas and a massive vanity station equipped with professional studio lighting. Several bottles of imported champagne were already chilling in silver buckets, courtesy of my stolen trust funds. Chloe immediately began assigning stations to her 5 bridesmaids. She pointed out where her makeup artist would set up, and where her custom Parisian gown would hang for the photographer to capture the perfect aesthetic shot. I stood quietly near the entrance, leaning against the doorframe, checking a client email on my phone. Chloe suddenly stopped her frantic planning and turned to face me. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, pasting on a deeply fake apologetic pout. She walked over to where I was standing, her designer heels sinking into the thick carpet. Kiara, she began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I have been thinking a lot about this morning of the wedding. My bridesmaids and I really need a soft, feminine aesthetic to get ready. It is so important that the room stays completely relaxed and stress-free. She paused, pretending to struggle with her next words. You just have this very intense corporate energy. You are always so serious and focused on business. I really feel like having you in the suite might ruin the pre-wedding vibe. I slowly locked my phone and looked at her. A woman who was drowning in credit card debt was currently standing inside a luxury suite, completely financed by my stolen assets, telling me my corporate energy was too much of a buzzkill for her aesthetic. Before I could even formulate a response, my mother chimed in from across the room. Brenda walked over, standing shoulder to shoulder with Chloe, presenting a unified front against the family scapegoat. Chloe is absolutely right, Kiara, my mother said, crossing her arms. You are always so stiff. You do not know how to just relax and let things be beautiful. Just get dressed at your own apartment and meet us here right before the photos. We do not need you pacing around checking your spreadsheets while we are trying to celebrate this blessed union. I looked at the velvet chairs. I looked at the chilled champagne. I looked at the massive vanity mirrors. I knew with absolute legal certainty that I was the sole contracted lessee of this entire space for the next 72 hours. I literally owned the room they were standing in. I had the power to look at Sarah, the venue coordinator, and have them both escorted off the premises for trespassing right then and there. But an auditor knows the value of patience. If I kicked them out now, they would have 3 days to scramble and play the victim. They would find a way to twist the narrative and make me the villain who ruined the wedding before it even began. I needed them to get comfortable. I needed Chloe to sit in that expensive makeup chair. I needed Brenda to put on her mother of the groom dress and walk into that ballroom fully convinced she had won. I smoothed my features into a mask of complete and total compliance. I smiled my best, most agreeable smile. Of course, I said, my voice perfectly level. I completely understand, Chloe. This is your special day, and the vibe needs to be exactly what you want. I will get ready at my place and stay entirely out of your way until it is time for the reception. Chloe let out a dramatic sigh of relief, reaching out to touch my arm. Thank you so much for understanding, Kiara. I just knew you would get it. You are always so practical. I nodded politely, stepped out of the suite, and walked down the marble staircase. The moment the heavy front doors of the country club closed behind me, I pulled out my phone and called Aisha. She picked up immediately, asking for a status report. I walked to my car, laughing a deep, genuine laugh that echoed across the parking lot. I told Aisha that I had just been officially banished from my own luxury suite because my presence was a threat to the bridal aesthetic. Aisha let out a sharp scoff over the speakerphone. She asked me if we should pull the plug right now and lock the venue doors. I told her no. I told her we were going to let them have their mimosas. We were going to let them put on their expensive makeup and their stolen dresses. We were going to let the entire audience of fake wealthy relatives arrive and take their seats. The trap was perfectly set, and they had just locked themselves inside it. The tension only escalated during the rehearsal dinner on Friday night. Because my mother could not use the trust fund to pay for this particular event, she had to rely on my father's dwindling resources. Calvin had booked a mid-tier Italian restaurant downtown, trying his hardest to make it look like an exclusive private dining experience. It was a miserable failure. Chloe's parents spent the entire evening complaining loudly about the wine selection and the quality of the pasta. They turned their noses up at the waitstaff, acting highly offended that they were not dining at a 5-star steakhouse. Jamal sat at the head of the table, playing the role of the generous host, while Calvin silently sweated over the final bill. My mother spent the dinner darting between tables trying to appease Chloe's snobby relatives by loudly reminding them about the spectacular country club reception planned for the following evening. She kept promising them Wagyu beef and top-shelf liquor, desperately trying to buy their respect with my stolen money. I sat at the very end of the table nursing a glass of tap water and watching the absolute delusion play out in real time. Chloe's mother, a woman whose house was currently facing a tax lien, leaned across the table and asked me why I looked so quiet. She gave me a patronizing smile and said, "It must be so hard being the older unmarried sister watching my younger brother secure such a high-class bride." She told me not to worry and that maybe I would catch the bouquet. I smiled warmly at her, placing my napkin on the table. I thanked her for her concern and told her I was just quietly calculating the cost of tomorrow's festivities. I said weddings were such a fascinating investment, especially when you finally see who is really footing the bill. The comment flew completely over her head, but Aisha, who was sitting next to me as my plus one, had to take a long drink of her water to hide her smirk. The rehearsal dinner ended with my father nervously handing over his last functioning credit card, while my mother ushered the guests out the door, promising them a night of unparalleled luxury. I watched them drive away in their leased cars, heading back to their suburban homes to rest up for the big day. They were all sleeping soundly, completely unaware that the financial ground beneath their feet had already vanished. I drove back to my downtown penthouse, set my alarm for the following afternoon, and prepared to attend the most expensive cancellation in wedding history. Saturday morning arrived with a massive thunderstorm. I woke up in my penthouse to the sound of heavy rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. To anyone else, a torrential downpour on their wedding day would be a terrible omen. To me, it was the absolute perfect backdrop for the financial reckoning I had orchestrated. My phone buzzed on the nightstand at exactly 8 in the morning. It was my mother. I answered the call and put it on speakerphone while I calmly poured my morning coffee. Brenda did not offer a greeting. She immediately launched into a frantic, high-pitched demand. She told me there was a catastrophic logistical crisis, and I needed to get my car and drive out to the suburbs right this second. The artisanal hand poured candles and the custom glass centerpieces Chloe had demanded from a boutique supplier had been delivered to my parents' house instead of the country club. I took a slow sip of my dark roast and asked why Jamal could not simply put the boxes in the back of his car and drive them to the venue himself. My mother actually gasped into the receiver like I had just suggested a crime. She said Jamal was currently resting his vocal cords for his vows and getting a hot towel shave at a luxury barber shop so he could look like a proper chief executive for the photos. She said my father was busy wrangling the groomsmen and paying for their lunch. She explicitly reminded me that since I was banished from the bridal suite and had absolutely nothing to do all morning, it was my fundamental duty as a sister to handle the heavy lifting. She told me to wear something I did not mind ruining because the boxes were incredibly heavy and the rain was coming down in sheets. I did not argue. I did not point out the sheer audacity of forcing a certified public accountant to act as an unpaid delivery driver for a wedding she was secretly funding. I just smiled a cold, sharp smile into the empty kitchen. I told her I would be right there. I put on a pair of dark leggings, a simple black turtleneck, and my waterproof boots. I drove my luxury sport utility vehicle out to my parents' house, gripping the leather steering wheel while the rain pounded against the windshield. When I arrived, the situation was exactly as ridiculous as I expected. There were 12 massive cardboard boxes stacked on the covered front porch. They were filled with solid glass vases, heavy mirrored bases, and hundreds of custom candles. My father was nowhere to be found. Jamal was off getting pampered. I was entirely alone. I popped the trunk of my car and started moving the boxes. The wind was whipping rain onto the porch, completely soaking my hair and my clothes within the first 5 minutes. The boxes were incredibly heavy, straining my arms and shoulders. The wet cardboard slipped against my damp sleeves. Any normal sibling would have been absolutely furious. Any normal person would have thrown the glass onto the driveway and driven away. But I am an auditor. I view every single ounce of disrespect as a data point in a much larger ledger. Every heavy box I lifted in the freezing rain was just adding another zero to the metaphorical bill I was preparing to hand them. I loaded all 12 boxes into the back of my car, slammed the trunk shut, and drove to the historic country club. When I pulled up to the grand entrance, the valet immediately rushed out with a massive umbrella trying to open my door. I rolled the window down and told him to direct me to the service entrance around the back. My mother had specifically instructed the venue staff that I was handling the back-end logistics and should not clutter up the main lobby. I parked near the loading dock and began the grueling process of hauling the heavy wet boxes up the service stairs. My arms burned. My boots squeaked on the service floor. My hair was plastered to my cheeks. The venue coordinator, Sarah, happened to be walking down the service hallway with a clipboard when I brought the fourth box inside. She stopped dead in her tracks, staring at me in absolute shock. She knew exactly who I was. She knew my name was on the master contract. She knew I was the sole financier of this entire $120,000 production. She rushed forward, offering to call the maintenance staff to help me, but I shook my head. I gave her a very subtle, reassuring look. I told her to let me do it. I told her I needed to deliver the custom favors directly to the bridal suite upstairs. Sarah slowly nodded, her eyes wide with understanding. She stepped back and let me carry my own stolen assets up the marble staircase. I reached the heavy double doors of the luxury bridal suite and balanced a massive box of glass centerpieces on my knee so I could turn the brass handle. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The contrast between my reality and theirs was staggering. The suite was a haven of warmth and artificial perfection. Soft ambient music was playing from a portable speaker. The smell of expensive hairspray and imported floral perfume hung thick in the air. Chloe was sitting in the center of the room, wearing a customized silk robe with the word bride embroidered in gold thread across the back. Two professional makeup artists were hovering over her, contouring her cheekbones and applying individual false eyelashes. Her 5 bridesmaids were lounging on the velvet sofas, sipping mimosas from crystal flutes, laughing and taking curated photos for social media. My mother, Brenda, was sitting at a secondary vanity station, having her hair pinned up into an elaborate style by a private stylist. They all turned to look at me when I walked in, dripping wet, carrying 40 pounds of glass. The music did not stop, but the conversation certainly did. Chloe looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my damp clothes and wet hair. She let out a dramatic, heavy sigh and complained that the humidity from my wet jacket was going to absolutely ruin the aesthetic of the room and mess up her setting spray. She did not say thank you. She did not ask if I was okay. She just stared at me like I was a contracted laborer who had accidentally tracked mud into her pristine environment. My mother did not even turn fully around in her makeup chair. She just looked at my reflection through the large vanity mirror. She snapped her fingers and pointed toward a dark corner near the bathroom doors. She told me to put the boxes down carefully so I did not shatter the glass. She ordered me to make sure I did not drip rainwater onto the antique Persian rug, because Chloe's family would be arriving soon for the pre-wedding portrait session, and the room needed to look completely flawless. Then she casually mentioned that once I finished bringing all 12 boxes upstairs, I needed to go down to the ballroom and start ironing the linen napkins because the catering staff was moving too slowly for her liking. I stood there holding the heavy box, while the rainwater dripped from my chin onto the collar of my shirt. I looked at Chloe sipping the champagne I paid for. I looked at Brenda getting her hair styled with the money she stole from my grandmother's legacy trust. I felt a cold, absolute calm wash over my entire nervous system. I did not argue. I did not throw the box on the floor. I played the part of the obedient, invisible workhorse perfectly. I smiled. It was a sharp, chilling smile that none of them possessed the situational awareness to understand. I told my mother I would put the boxes exactly where she wanted them. I told Chloe I was so sorry for bringing the rain into her beautiful suite. I walked over to the corner, gently set the heavy glass centerpieces on the floor, and quietly backed out of the room. I spent the next hour walking up and down the service stairs in the pouring rain, carrying every single box inside. I let them treat me like a pack mule. I let them bark orders at me. I complied with every single ridiculous demand they threw my way. I did the heavy lifting with absolute grace because I knew with complete certainty that the foundation of their entire fairy tale was rigged with explosives and I was holding the only detonator. I finished my grunt work, wiped the rain from my face, and headed down toward the ballroom to inspect my property. I left the bridal suite and took the service elevator down to the main ballroom. The double doors opened to reveal a breathtaking space. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over 30 round tables draped in heavy ivory linen. The florist was busy arranging the cascading white orchids I had just hauled up the stairs in the freezing rain. It was a $120,000 masterpiece. And legally speaking, every single flower, every linen napkin, and every champagne flute belonged entirely to me. I walked over to the gift table near the grand entrance to arrange the silver card box and smooth out the imported silk runners. The room was quiet, except for the clinking of glassware as the catering staff set the tables. I was adjusting a floral centerpiece when I heard footsteps and voices echoing from the adjoining side hallway. It was an area designated for the bridal party to stage before their grand entrance. I recognized the voices immediately. It was Jamal and Chloe. They had slipped away from the pre-wedding photo session upstairs and were arguing in hushed, frantic tones. I froze, stepping back into the deep shadow of a large marble pillar. I did not want to interrupt them. I simply wanted to listen. Chloe sounded incredibly panicked. She was pacing the hallway, her heavy Parisian gown rustling against the expensive carpet. She asked Jamal how they were supposed to afford their lifestyle after the honeymoon. She complained that her parents had maxed out their very last credit card just to pay for the rehearsal dinner the night before. She was on the verge of tears, demanding to know where they were going to live once they returned from their tropical getaway. She said she absolutely refused to move into a cheap suburban apartment because her carefully curated brand required a luxury aesthetic. She told Jamal she was terrified her relatives would find out they were actually broke. Jamal laughed. It was a cocky, arrogant sound that echoed off the marble walls. He grabbed Chloe by the shoulders and told her to stop stressing out and ruining her professional makeup. He told her our mother had already handled everything. He said Brenda had secured them a luxury downtown loft in the city center, completely rent-free for the next 2 years as an incredible wedding gift. Chloe gasped, her voice suddenly light and excited. She asked how Brenda could possibly afford a luxury downtown loft on top of paying for this massive wedding. Jamal bragged that our mother had incredible real estate connections and had already handed him the executed lease agreement that very morning. He pulled out his phone to show her the address. He read the street name and the unit number out loud, telling Chloe it was a gorgeous top-floor penthouse with skyline views. My heart stopped beating. The blood drained completely from my face. The address Jamal just read was not a random apartment building. It was a high-end commercial and residential property located right in the heart of the financial district. A property that was completely owned and operated by my personal real estate portfolio. I had purchased that specific penthouse unit 3 years ago, and it commanded a premium monthly rent from corporate executives. Brenda had not just stolen cash from my grandmother's legacy trust. She had crossed a line so severe it bordered on absolute sociopathy. My mother had illegally drafted a fraudulent lease agreement forging my signature as the landlord to give my chronically unemployed brother free housing in my own private building. She had essentially handed over the keys to my property behind my back, fully expecting me to just absorb the financial loss and allow them to squat in my penthouse to maintain their grand illusion of wealth. The magnitude of the betrayal settled over me like a heavy lead blanket. This was the final snap. This was the exact moment the last remaining shred of my family loyalty turned to ash. I realized in that shadowy hallway that my family did not just view me as a convenient automatic teller machine. They viewed me as a complete non-entity. I was not a daughter. I was not a sister. I was an invisible resource generator. They felt perfectly entitled to steal my cash, leverage my commercial properties, and now hand over my private real estate portfolio like it was a public park built for their personal enjoyment. They truly believed I existed solely to subsidize their delusions of grandeur. They thought I was so desperate for their approval that I would return from my downtown office one day, find my brother living in my penthouse, and simply accept it to keep the family peace. I did not confront them in the hallway. I did not step out from behind the marble pillar and scream about real estate fraud or forged leases. I simply turned around and walked silently back through the ballroom, heading straight for the catering preparation room. I found a quiet corner near the industrial refrigerators and pulled out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. My breathing was slow and controlled. I opened my message thread with Mr. Sterling. I typed out exactly what I had just overheard regarding the fraudulent lease agreement for my downtown property. I instructed him to draft an immediate eviction notice and a formal trespass warning for Jamal and Chloe. Mr. Sterling responded within 30 seconds. The text bubble appeared showing he was typing rapidly. He confirmed the legal paperwork would be drafted immediately. He noted that forging a lease agreement elevated my mother's actions from financial theft to severe real estate fraud. He asked if I wanted him to dispatch local law enforcement to the country club for the immediate arrest of my mother and brother. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. Having Brenda dragged out of the country club in handcuffs before the reception even started would certainly be satisfying. But it would also allow her to play the victim. She would scream and cry and tell Chloe's family that a misunderstanding with her cruel daughter had ruined the day. I refused to give her that out. I wanted her to face her own destruction at the exact height of her pride. I typed back a simple command. I told Mr. Sterling to hold the police on standby. I told him I needed to execute the social destruction first. I wanted the fake lease agreement physically delivered to my hands tonight. Mr. Sterling replied that he would have a courier bring the documents to the venue within the hour. Next, I texted my business partner, Aisha. She replied that she was pulling into the country club valet right now. I told her the trap was fully loaded and the final tripwire had just been crossed. I informed her about the fake lease agreement and the pure delusion happening in the bridal suite. I instructed Aisha to find the venue manager, Sarah, and ensure the security staff was briefed on my exact timeline for the evening. Aisha texted back a single fiery confirmation. She was ready. I locked my phone and slipped it into the pocket of my jacket. The rain outside the high ballroom windows was finally beginning to slow down, clearing the way for the evening guests to arrive. The catering staff was lighting the candles on the tables, creating a beautiful romantic ambiance for a marriage built entirely on stolen money and criminal fraud. I walked into the nearest guest restroom, washed my hands, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The obedient, invisible workhorse who hauled heavy boxes in the freezing rain was dead. The wealthy, unbothered architect of their downfall was ready to take the stage. I fixed my posture, smoothed out. My clothes, took one final deep breath, and walked out to join the wedding reception. The laughter from my mother's cruel joke was still bouncing off the crystal chandeliers as I made my deliberate march across the ballroom. The distance from table 14 to the main stage was significant, giving the 200 guests plenty of time to realize that the punchline of the evening was no longer sitting quietly in the back. The chuckles and polite applause began to taper off completely. The heavy clinking of silverware against fine china stopped. A profound, heavy silence rolled over the room like a thick fog. I kept my posture perfectly rigid. My designer dress swept elegantly against the imported marble floors. I did not look angry. I did not look embarrassed. I looked like a woman walking into a boardroom to finalize a hostile takeover. I locked eyes with my business partner, Aisha, who was seated near the front. She gave me a single sharp nod. The courier from Mr. Sterling had arrived. She tapped her designer handbag, signaling that the legal documents, including the eviction notice and the itemized financial ledger, were secured and ready for deployment. I reached the edge of the elevated stage and walked up the 3 carpeted steps with absolute grace. My mother Brenda was still standing at the center of the dance floor, basking in the fading spotlight. Her practiced pageant smile began to slip the moment she saw my face up close. She had expected me to shrink. She had expected me to lower my head and hide in the bathroom. Seeing me ascend the stage with the posture of an absolute conqueror completely short-circuited her brain. "What are you doing, Kiara?" she hissed through clenched teeth, keeping her back to the audience so they could not read her lips. "Go sit down. You are ruining the aesthetic." I did not answer her. I simply reached out and took the microphone directly from her manicured hand. I did not snatch it aggressively. I executed the movement with such smooth, fluid confidence that she instinctively let go before she even realized what was happening. Her hand dropped to her side. The panic in her eyes was immediate and visceral. She took a half step back, her heavy silk gown rustling against the polished floor. I turned to face the massive crowd. I looked out over the sea of round tables, the cascading white orchids, and the towering champagne flutes. I found the sweetheart table where my brother Jamal and his new bride Chloe were sitting. Jamal looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Chloe was gripping her champagne glass so tightly her knuckles were completely white. I raised the microphone to my lips. I did not shout. I did not let my voice tremble. I adopted the exact same melodic, performative church lady tone my mother had perfected over the past 3 decades. The kind of voice that sounds incredibly sweet but cuts right down to the bone. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice echoing flawlessly through the state-of-the-art sound system. I know I was not listed on the official wedding program tonight, but as the only daughter of this proud family, I simply could not let this beautiful celebration pass without offering a few words of my own. A murmur rippled through the back of the room. I smiled a warm, radiant smile that did not reach my eyes. I looked directly at table 1, right at the front of the stage. That was where Chloe's parents were seated. They were wearing expensive formal wear, sitting rigidly in their chairs, projecting that fake aura of old money elegance they had so desperately tried to sell to my mother. I am so incredibly honored to stand here tonight and look out at this magnificent gathering. I continued pacing slowly across the stage. I want to specifically address Chloe's wonderful family. You have all traveled so far and brought such an undeniable standard of excellence to this union. My mother Brenda has spent the last 6 months telling our entire family about your deep historical roots. She told us all about your sophisticated tastes, your sprawling country estates, and your absolute requirement for a luxury aesthetic. She made it very clear that only the absolute best would be acceptable for your daughter. Chloe's mother puffed out her chest slightly, adjusting her pearl necklace, preening under the public validation. She had absolutely no idea that I had run her credit report. She had no idea I knew about her massive second mortgage and her multiple tax liens. She just smiled graciously, acting like she fully deserved the royal treatment she was receiving. "And we certainly did provide the best, did we not?" I asked, gesturing widely to the extravagant room. "Just look at these gorgeous imported white orchids hanging from the ceiling. Look at the 12-piece band waiting to play your favorite classic hits. Taste the incredible Wagyu beef the catering staff has so carefully prepared. This entire evening is an absolute masterpiece of high society event planning. It is a stunning display of generational wealth and limitless financial resources." I paused, letting the sheer opulence of the room speak for itself. I looked back at my mother. Brenda was gripping the edge of the stage podium, her knuckles stark white. She was silently pleading with me, with her eyes begging me to put the microphone down and walk away. She knew exactly what I was doing. She knew I was building the platform as high as possible just so the drop would be completely fatal. As my mother so eloquently pointed out just a few moments ago, I said, my tone remaining effortlessly cheerful, "I might be 35 years old and unmarried, but I am most definitely good for a check. In fact, I am so incredibly good for a check that I feel it is my absolute duty to clarify exactly how this spectacular display of wealth was achieved tonight. Because when two prestigious families merge together, transparency is the ultimate foundation of a successful union." I walked over to the edge of the stage, stopping right in front of Chloe's parents. I maintained direct, unbroken eye contact with her father. The smug satisfaction on his face was slowly beginning to curdle into confusion. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. "You see, this wedding was not funded by my brother's tech startup because he has never actually launched an application or held a steady corporate job." I spoke with crisp, flawless articulation, ensuring every single syllable hit the back walls of the ballroom. "And this luxury reception was not funded by my parents because their credit cards were completely declined by this venue 2 weeks ago." A loud collective gasp erupted from the tables near the front. Chloe's mother dropped her jaw, her hand flying up to her throat. Jamal buried his face in his hands. Chloe shot up from her sweetheart chair, her custom designer gown pooling around her feet. I raised my free hand, silencing the crowd with a single authoritative gesture. I was not finished. The autopsy had only just begun. I was preparing to dissect every single dollar they had stolen, every single contract they had forged, and every single lie they had built their fake empire upon. I stood on that stage, breathing in the crisp, air-conditioned air, feeling the absolute intoxicating rush of total, unadulterated power. I was the architect of their ruin, and the demolition was officially underway. My mother is absolutely right, I said, my voice dropping into a deadly serious register. I am exceptionally good for a check. Specifically, I am good for the $120,000 check that financed this entire production. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out the thick leather folder Aisha had handed me moments before. I opened it deliberately, flattening the crisp legal documents against the wooden podium. I looked down at Chloe, who was trembling so hard her custom veil was shaking. I hope you are all enjoying the meal, I continued, projecting my voice over the stunned silence. That prime Wagyu beef you are cutting into was paid for by me. The imported vintage champagne you just raised in a toast to my brother was paid for by me. The cascading white orchids hanging above your heads, the 12-piece band that just finished playing, and yes, even that beautiful custom lace gown Chloe is currently wearing, were all paid for entirely by me. Chloe let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Her mother covered her face with both hands. Jamal tried to stand up, but his legs seemed to give out and he sank right back into his chair. Brenda finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. She lunged forward, trying to snatch the microphone from my hand, but I simply pivoted my shoulder, blocking her completely. I shot her a look so cold it froze her in her tracks. I am not finished, I whispered harshly to her before turning back to the mesmerized crowd. I am sure you are all wondering why a 35-year-old unmarried woman would generously sponsor such a lavish event, I said, looking out at the sea of bewildered faces. The truth is, I did not volunteer. 2 weeks ago, my mother Brenda realized that my father Calvin had completely maxed out his credit cards, trying to keep up with the demands of this wedding. In a desperate panic to maintain the illusion of generational wealth to Chloe's family, my mother went to the bank. She accessed a highly secure legacy trust fund established by my late grandmother. And then she committed a federal crime. I held up the bank authorization forms, displaying them for the front row to see clearly. My mother forged my signature to authorize a massive line of credit against my commercial real estate. I announced, letting the heavy legal terms sink into the room. She committed grand larceny and wire fraud to bypass the withdrawal limits, stealing $55,000 in cash and leveraging another $150,000 in debt just so she could save face. She stole from her own mother's legacy to fund a party for a son who refuses to work. The murmurs erupted into loud, shocked chatter. Several of Brenda's church board members sitting at table 3 began whispering furiously to each other, shaking their heads in disgust. Calvin slumped forward, resting his forehead against the cool table linen, looking utterly defeated. But I am a certified public accountant, I said, raising my voice slightly to cut through the noise. I track every single penny that crosses my desk. When I discovered the theft, I did not call the police immediately. Instead, I contacted my legal team. I held up the thick stack of vendor agreements with the venue letterheads visible at the top, because the stolen funds were sourced entirely from my trust account and deployed via a fraudulent instrument. I had the absolute legal right to step in and assume total control of those assets, I explained. I contacted this historic country club, the luxury florist, the catering company, and the bridal boutique in Paris. I proved that I was the primary financier. I had every single vendor contract legally restructured to reflect my name. I looked directly at Chloe, whose mascara was beginning to run down her cheeks. I am not a guest at this wedding, I declared. I am the sole legal client of this venue. I am the primary account holder for the caterer, the florist, and the open bar. You have all been attending an event that I legally own. I closed the leather folder with a loud, definitive snap. And as the sole financial stakeholder, I continued, my voice ringing with finality. I have determined that there has been a severe breach of respect by the supposed guests of honor. Therefore, I am officially terminating all vendor contracts effective immediately. Brenda let out a wail that sounded like a wounded animal. You cannot do this, she screamed, dropping her church lady facade entirely. This is my son's wedding. I ignored her completely. I looked past the sea of tables straight toward the back of the room where the kitchen doors stood. Sarah, the venue coordinator, was standing there clutching her clipboard. She had been waiting for this exact moment. I gave her a single sharp nod. Sarah spoke into her radio headset. Less than 2 seconds later, the execution began. The heavy, romantic, dim lighting of the ballroom vanished. The bright fluorescent house lights snapped on, instantly flooding the room with a harsh, unforgiving glare that completely killed the luxurious aesthetic. The 12-piece band abruptly stopped playing mid-song, packing up their instruments with practiced speed. At the back of the room, the bartenders immediately pulled the heavy metal security grates down over the premium liquor bottles, locking them with a loud clatter. The open bar was officially closed. Then the catering staff emerged from the swinging doors. A highly coordinated army of waiters and waitresses marched out into the blindingly bright ballroom carrying empty plastic busing tubs. They did not wait for the guests to finish chewing. They walked straight up to the tables and began pulling the plates of Wagyu beef and roasted asparagus right out from under the guests. They reached over shoulders, swiping the imported champagne flutes and clearing the expensive crystal glassware. The chaos was absolute and glorious. Chloe's snobby relatives were protesting loudly as their half-eaten steaks were unceremoniously dumped into plastic bins. Some guests stood up, clutching their purses, looking around in sheer panic. Brenda grabbed the sleeve of a passing waiter, demanding he put the food back down, but the young man simply pulled his arm away and continued clearing table 4. He worked for me, not her. Chloe burst into heavy, ugly sobs, burying her face in her hands and ruining her professional makeup. Jamal tried to comfort her, but she violently shoved his hands away, screaming that he had humiliated her. She stood up, grabbing the skirt of the custom Paris gown I owned, and tried to run toward the exit, but her heels caught in the heavy fabric, causing her to stumble awkwardly against the sweetheart table. I stood on the stage watching the $120,000 illusion dismantle itself piece by piece. The floral staff marched in with rolling carts, beginning to detach the cascading white orchids from the ceiling rigging. The luxury dream was being systematically packed into cardboard boxes and wheeled out the service doors. My mother fell to her knees right there on the stage, weeping into her hands. She had traded her integrity, her relationship with me, and her entire social standing for an event that was currently being tossed into garbage bags by the catering staff. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no pity. She had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. She had tried to sacrifice my future to fund her favorite son's delusion. But I had refused to be the victim. I stepped over the train of my mother's dress and walked calmly down the stage stairs. I still had one final piece of business to conduct before I left them all to their ruin. I walked straight down the center aisle, ignoring the shocked stares and the frantic whispering of the guests. I headed directly toward the sweetheart table, where my brother and his weeping bride were currently experiencing the absolute worst day of their lives. The catering staff was already unfastening the silk drapery from the archway behind the sweetheart table when I finally reached them. Jamal was standing up, holding his hands out in a frantic, pleading gesture. He looked absolutely pathetic. The custom tuxedo he was wearing suddenly looked like a cheap Halloween costume on a little boy playing dress-up. Chloe was sitting in her chair, hyperventilating. Her chest heaved violently, and dark streaks of expensive waterproof mascara were running down her flushed cheeks, staining the delicate lace neckline of her stolen Parisian gown. Jamal tried to step in front of her, attempting to block my path. He lowered his voice into a harsh, desperate whisper, begging me to stop. He told me I was taking things way too far and that I was completely traumatizing his new wife. He actually had the audacity to say that we could have handled this dispute privately on Monday morning instead of ruining the most important day of his life. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from him. I looked him up and down with absolute clinical detachment. I told him that Monday morning was reserved for my paying clients, and he was simply a fraudulent expense I was currently writing off. I stepped around him and looked directly at Chloe. She flinched, pressing her back hard against her chair. I reached into my leather folder one last time. I pulled out the thick, stapled document that Mr. Sterling had sent over with the courier. I dropped it squarely onto the center of their sweetheart table, right on top of a scattered pile of white orchid petals. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood made Chloe jump. I asked her if she recognized the address printed on the front page. Chloe stared at the document with wide, terrified eyes. She gave a small, trembling nod. She knew exactly what it was. I kept my voice perfectly conversational, explaining the reality of her situation so that the guests sitting at the nearby tables could hear every single word. I told Chloe that I had overheard her conversation with Jamal in the hallway earlier that afternoon. I told her I knew exactly what my mother had promised them. Jamal had assured her they were moving into a gorgeous top-floor penthouse in the financial district, completely rent-free for the next 2 years as a generous wedding gift. I watched Chloe swallow hard, her eyes darting between me and Jamal. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the edge of their table. I broke the illusion completely. I told her that Brenda did not have any high society real estate connections. Brenda did not own a single piece of downtown property. I told her that the penthouse address printed on that lease agreement belonged entirely to my personal commercial real estate portfolio. I had purchased that specific building 3 years ago with money I earned from my accounting firm. Chloe let out a sharp gasp, turning to look at Jamal with pure betrayal flashing across her face. Jamal could not even meet her gaze. He stared down at his expensive leather shoes, looking like a cornered animal. I explained to Chloe that my mother had illegally drafted a fake lease agreement. Brenda had forged my signature as the landlord to give my chronically unemployed brother free housing in my private building simply to impress her and her relatives. I told her that the document sitting on the table was a complete legal fiction. They had absolutely no rights to that property. I tapped my fingernail against the top of the stapled packet. I informed them both that Mr. Sterling had attached an official trespass warning to the back of that fake lease. I told them that if either of them so much as stepped 1 foot into the lobby of my building, my private security team had strict, unwavering instructions to call the police immediately and have them both arrested and prosecuted for trespassing. I looked right at Chloe and delivered the final fatal blow to her aesthetic dream. I told her she had no luxury penthouse waiting for her after the honeymoon. She was officially homeless. Chloe let out a gut-wrenching sob, burying her face in her hands. She turned to Jamal, screaming at him, demanding to know if it was true. She asked him how he could lie to her about being a tech executive. She asked him how his family could possibly fake an entire luxury lifestyle. Jamal reached out, trying to grab her hands, stuttering through pathetic excuses about venture capital funding and temporary cash flow issues. I was still trying to sell the dream, even while the catering staff was literally packing up the table linens around them. Chloe's father suddenly stormed over from table 1. His face was bright red with anger and embarrassment. He demanded to know what the hell was going on and why the bar had been shut down. He looked at me, expecting me to shrink away from his misplaced upper-class authority. I did not even blink. I stood my ground and looked him dead in the eye. I told him that his new son-in-law was a chronically unemployed fraud who lived off our mother. I told him the custom dress his daughter was currently crying in was purchased with money stolen from my grandmother's trust fund. I suggested that since Jamal and Chloe had no luxury penthouse to return to, he should probably clear out his guest room so the newlyweds would have a place to sleep tonight. I reminded him that considering his multiple tax liens and maxed-out second mortgage, a crowded house was exactly what he deserved. Chloe's father stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. He realized instantly that I had run his financials. The fake old money facade he had been projecting all evening evaporated into thin air. I turned my attention back to the sweetheart table. I reached into my folder and pulled out one final piece of paper. It was the itemized financial ledger calculating the exact total of the fraudulent line of credit my mother had taken out against my commercial properties. I slid the invoice across the table, stopping it right in front of Jamal. I told my brother that the grand total for this fake luxury experience was $120,000. I explained that since my signature was forged to secure the loan, my legal team was already in the process of transferring the entire massive liability dispute directly to Brenda. Our mother was now facing federal fraud charges and a mountain of crushing debt that she could never possibly repay on her own. I looked at Jamal and smiled a genuinely bright, unbothered smile. I told him that since he and Chloe were the ones who had demanded the imported white orchids, the Wagyu beef, and the 12-piece band, they should probably figure out a way to help Brenda pay that money back. I suggested he finally go get a minimum wage job since his beauty app was clearly never going to launch. Jamal stared at the invoice, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He finally realized the scope of the disaster he and my mother had engineered. There was no safety net left. The bank of Kiara was permanently closed, and the vault had been completely emptied. He was looking at a lifetime of debt, a furious new wife, and a mother who was likely heading to prison. I picked up my empty leather folder and smoothed the front of my dress. The ballroom was completely chaotic now. Guests were shouting, demanding answers from each other. Waiters were rolling heavy carts of packed-up centerpieces toward the service elevators. The bright fluorescent lights illuminated every single flaw in the room. The luxury aesthetic was entirely dead and buried. I looked at Jamal and Chloe one last time. They looked absolutely miserable sitting in the wreckage of their stolen fairy tale. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table, and delivered my final parting words. I told them to have a wonderful honeymoon, assuming they could still afford the plane tickets. Then I turned around and walked away without looking back. I turned my back on the sweetheart table and began my deliberate walk toward the main exit. I did not rush my steps. I kept my pace entirely steady and my chin held high. Behind me, the absolute implosion of their manufactured reality finally hit critical mass. I heard the sharp, violent scrape of a heavy wooden chair being pushed back aggressively against the hardwood floor. It was Chloe's father. He had completely abandoned his fake aristocratic poise and the polite country club demeanor he had been projecting all evening. He marched directly up to Jamal, pointing a shaking, furious finger right at my brother's face. He demanded to know exactly what kind of sick con game Jamal was running on his daughter. He shouted loudly enough for the entire room to hear that his little girl was not going to be legally tied to a chronically unemployed fraud facing federal felony charges. Jamal stammered, throwing his hands up in a pathetic, desperate attempt to explain away the ironclad evidence I had just dropped on their table. He tried to claim it was all a massive misunderstanding over venture capital timelines and delayed corporate funding. He was still trying to spin a web of lies, even while the catering staff literally removed the tablecloth from under his hands. But Chloe was not listening to a single word of his pathetic excuses. The sheer crushing weight of her public humiliation finally broke her completely. She let out a piercing, high-pitched scream that cut right through the chaotic noise of the busy waitstaff. She slammed her hands down hard on the sweetheart table, sending 2 crystal champagne flutes crashing to the floor. The glass shattered into 100 jagged pieces, mirroring the sudden destruction of her entire high society aesthetic. Chloe grabbed the delicate imported lace of her custom Parisian gown, pulling at the expensive fabric as she stood up. She shrieked at Jamal, calling him a manipulative liar and a broke loser. She demanded to know how he could dare to embarrass her in front of her entire extended family and all her carefully invited friends. She was sobbing hysterically. Thick, dark streams of waterproof mascara and expensive eyeliner ran heavily down her flushed face, leaving harsh black streaks across her heavily contoured cheeks. The flawless old money elegance she had practiced for months evaporated in a matter of seconds. She looked exactly like a spoiled toddler throwing a massive tantrum in the middle of a brightly lit, empty ballroom. She ripped the custom silk veil out of her hair, completely ruining her professional salon updo, and threw the expensive fabric directly at Jamal's chest, before collapsing onto the floor in a heap of crying tulle and lace. As I continued walking past the center tables, I briefly glanced at my mother's church congregation. The very women Brenda had spent months trying to impress were now gathered in a tight circle, whispering frantically and shaking their heads in profound judgment. They looked at Brenda with expressions of pure, unfiltered disgust. My mother's prestigious position on the church leadership board, her entire carefully curated social identity, was evaporating right in front of her eyes. She was no longer the wealthy, generous matriarch raising a successful tech executive. She was a petty, desperate criminal who stole from her own mother's legacy trust just to fund a lie. Brenda saw them looking. She saw her beautiful kingdom burning down to the studs. And then she looked directly at me. I was about 20 feet away from the grand exit, walking away completely unbothered and entirely victorious. The narcissistic rage inside her finally boiled over. She could not handle the fact that I had outsmarted her at her own game. She could not stand that I was walking away with my wealth and my dignity completely intact while she was left holding the ashes of her grand delusion. I heard her heavy, frantic footsteps pounding against the floorboards behind me. She screamed my name, her voice cracking with pure toxic venom. She charged through the chaotic maze of half-empty tables, shoving heavy wooden chairs out of her way with brute force. She raised her right hand high in the air, her face contorted into a mask of absolute fury, fully intending to slap the calm, satisfied expression right off my face. I did not flinch. I did not even break my stride or turn around to brace for the impact. I knew I did not have to. My business partner Aisha had been tracking Brenda's erratic movements the entire time. Aisha stepped out from the crowd with the swift, flawless precision of a highly trained professional. She positioned herself directly between me and my charging mother. As Brenda swung her arm down with all her might, Aisha simply reached up and caught my mother's wrist mid-air. Aisha did not struggle or stumble. She just gripped Brenda's arm with unwavering strength, stopping the physical assault instantly and completely. Brenda gasped, struggling futilely against Aisha's iron grip. Aisha looked my mother dead in the eye and spoke in a tone so dangerously calm it sent a visible chill through the surrounding guests. She told Brenda that if she ever tried to lay a single finger on me again, the federal fraud charges would be the absolute least of her legal problems. She told her to back down immediately and accept her humiliating defeat with whatever tiny shred of dignity she had left in her body. Aisha firmly shoved Brenda's arm back toward her chest, stepping back to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. Right on cue, the venue manager Sarah gave the final signal from the back wall. The heavy mahogany doors to the grand lobby swung wide open, and 4 large private security guards stepped into the ballroom. I had personally contracted them earlier in the week specifically for this exact moment. They were highly professional, dressed in sharp black suits and fully briefed on the exact dynamics of the situation. They moved in a synchronized formation, quickly surrounding Aisha and me, creating an impenetrable human barricade between us and my screaming mother. Brenda was shouting hysterically now, demanding that the security guards arrest me for ruining her son's beautiful wedding. She pointed wildly at me, screaming to anyone who would listen that I was a bitter, jealous liar who was trying to destroy my own family. Over by the dance floor, Jamal was yelling back at Chloe's father, who was currently threatening to sue my brother for extreme emotional distress and financial damages. Chloe was still wailing loudly on the floor by the sweetheart table, completely inconsolable and refusing to let anyone help her up. The entire scene was a chaotic, deafening symphony of their own making. Aisha and I turned our backs on the screaming madness. The security team escorted us through the grand lobby with absolute flawless precision. We walked past the bewildered valet attendants, the confused late-arriving guests, and the venue staff who were busy locking up the facility. We did not look back once. We stepped through the massive glass doors and out into the cool, fresh night air. The heavy thunderstorm had finally passed, leaving the country club parking lot slick and reflecting the warm, amber glow of the tall streetlights. The valet immediately brought my luxury sport utility vehicle around to the front curb, leaving the engine running. I handed him a generous cash tip, opening the passenger door for Aisha before sliding into the driver's seat. I put my hands on the leather steering wheel and let out a long, slow breath. Through the rear-view mirror, I could see the bright, harsh fluorescent lights of the ballroom shining through the massive panoramic windows. I could see the frantic, shadowy silhouettes of my family tearing each other apart inside the luxury venue I legally owned. I shifted the car into drive and slowly pulled away from the country club, leaving them entirely trapped in the nightmare they had actively built for themselves. Monday morning arrived with the sharp, crisp efficiency of a freshly printed financial ledger. I was sitting at my custom oak desk at 8 o'clock sharp, sipping a double espresso while reviewing the final legal filings Mr. Sterling had sent over the weekend. The absolute chaos of Saturday night was completely behind me. Now it was time for the clinical, methodical execution of the consequences. According to the frantic voicemails I received and the detailed update Mr. Sterling provided later that afternoon, my mother did exactly what I predicted she would do. Brenda is entirely incapable of accepting defeat. She firmly believed she could still salvage the burning wreckage of Jamal's marriage by throwing more stolen money at the problem. Chloe was threatening an immediate annulment and demanding her non-refundable luxury honeymoon to the Maldives be converted into a solo revenge trip to compensate for her public humiliation. Brenda, desperate to maintain her status and keep her new white daughter-in-law, marched right into our primary bank branch at 9 in the morning. She walked through those glass doors wearing her designer sunglasses and an entitled aggressive attitude. She sat down at the desk of her favorite personal banker, demanding a cashier's check for $20,000 from the Legacy Trust to cover the island travel expenses and appease Chloe's furious parents. She handed over her identification, fully expecting the usual deference and immediate service. Instead, the banker typed on his keyboard, stopped, and stared blankly at his monitor. He nervously excused himself and disappeared into the back office. A few moments later, the branch manager came out. He did not offer Brenda a warm smile or a cup of complimentary coffee. He informed my mother that her access had been entirely revoked. He stated that the Legacy Trust was under a total administrative freeze pending a major federal fraud investigation. Brenda absolutely lost her mind. She screamed at the manager, demanding to see the override codes and claiming there was a massive misunderstanding. She pounded her fists on the desk, insisting she had legal rights to the money. The manager firmly asked her to lower her voice and leave the premises before he was forced to call armed security. As my mother stormed out of the bank lobby, her face flushed with red-hot rage and utter humiliation, she did not even notice the man in the unassuming gray suit leaning against the brick column near the automatic doors. I had coordinated the timing perfectly with Mr. Sterling. The man stepped forward, blocking her path to her luxury vehicle. He confirmed her identity and handed her a thick, heavy manila envelope. He told her she had been served before turning and walking away without another word. Inside that thick envelope was the legal hammer I had been preparing for weeks. It was a comprehensive civil lawsuit for severe financial fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and grand larceny. But more importantly, it included the formal legal notification that we had handed over the forged signature documents on the commercial real estate line of credit directly to the district attorney's office. She was not just facing a civil penalty to pay the money back. She was looking right down the barrel of a federal criminal investigation. The reality of a potential prison sentence was finally sitting right there in her manicured hands. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my private office phone rang. I looked at the caller identification display on my desk monitor. It was my father, Calvin. He had not called me directly in over 2 years. He only ever communicated through my mother or sent brief generic text messages on major holidays. But the very real threat of his wife actually going to a federal penitentiary had finally forced him to pick up the phone and dial my number. I answered the call on the first ring, putting him on speakerphone while I continued signing my tax review sheets. Calvin sounded terrible. His voice was shaking heavily, entirely stripped of the passive, avoidant comfort he usually wrapped himself in. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not apologize for sitting silently in his recliner while his wife financially exploited me. He immediately started begging like a cornered animal. He told me Brenda was hyperventilating on their living room floor. He said she was terrified, claiming I was trying to maliciously destroy the family over a simple wedding dispute. Calvin used the exact tired, weaponized language I fully expected him to use. He pleaded with me to drop the lawsuit and call off the criminal investigation. He told me that putting my own flesh and blood in a jail cell was a terrible sin that would stain my soul forever. He begged me to show mercy, promising that they would find a way to pay me back the $120,000 over time. He swore they would take out a second mortgage on their house, completely ignoring the fact that their credit was already destroyed by Brenda's reckless spending. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and listened to him beg. I let the silence stretch for 5 full seconds after he finished his desperate, rambling plea. Then I spoke with absolute, unwavering clarity. I told my father that mercy is a sacred gift reserved for people who actually feel genuine remorse, not for thieves who are simply panicking because they finally got caught. I reminded him of the exact moment I stood in his living room holding the forged commercial loan documents. I reminded him that he sat in his leather recliner and watched his wife commit felony fraud. He watched her forge my signature. He listened to her insult my career, my relationship status, and my entire existence, and he never said a single word to stop her. I told him his silence was active participation in the abuse, and I refused to reward his cowardice with a bailout. Calvin started to cry. I could hear his breath catching in his throat as he realized I was completely unmoved by his tears. He told me I was breaking his heart and tearing the family apart. I kept my voice ice cold. I told him I was not destroying the family. I was simply holding a mirror up to the absolute destruction they had actively caused themselves. I informed him that I would not be dropping a single charge and that Mr. Sterling would handle all future communication regarding the repayment of the stolen funds. I advised him to stop calling his daughter and start calling a criminal defense attorney because Brenda was going to need a very good one. I did not wait for his response. I pressed the end call button, disconnected the line, and permanently blocked his phone number from my personal and business accounts. I picked up my pen, took another sip of my espresso, and went right back to work. The weeks that followed were an absolute masterclass in watching gravity do its job. I did not have to lift another finger. I simply sat in my downtown office reviewing my quarterly profit margins and let the natural consequences of their delusions crush them under their own weight. First came the total collapse of my brother. Jamal had spent the last year coasting on the promise of his revolutionary beauty application. But without my mother funneling my stolen trust funds into his bank account to hire freelance developers to build a fake prototype, his pitch meetings were an absolute disaster. Word got back to me through Aisha that Jamal had managed to secure exactly one meeting with a mid-tier angel investor group. He walked into their boardroom wearing a cheap suit and tried to sell them a business model consisting entirely of empty buzzwords. They laughed him out of the building in under 15 minutes. The failure of his tech empire was the final nail in the coffin for his brand new marriage. Chloe lasted exactly 28 days as his wife. Once the shock of the ruined country club reception wore off, and the reality of Jamal's absolute poverty, set in the old money aesthetic she so desperately craved, completely vanished. There was no luxury penthouse in the financial district waiting for them. There was no all-expenses-paid trip to the Maldives. There was only a furious broke man-child and a mountain of public humiliation. Chloe filed for an expedited annulment citing gross financial misrepresentation and fraud. In the legal filings, her attorney explicitly referenced the fake lease agreement my mother had forged, proving that Jamal had knowingly lured her into a marriage based on a criminal fiction. Chloe scrubbed her entire social media presence, deleting every single meticulously curated photo of their engagement. She packed up her designer bags and moved right back into her parents' highly leveraged house. I actually felt a tiny fraction of pity for her. She was a gold digger who had accidentally struck fool's gold, and the resulting crash destroyed her completely. But the most spectacular downfall belonged entirely to my mother. The federal investigators did not care about her church attendance or her perfectly manicured lawn. They cared about the forged signatures on the commercial real estate documents. Mr. Sterling operated with the ruthless precision of a surgeon. He coordinated with the district attorney, presenting an airtight case of wire fraud and grand larceny that left absolutely no room for negotiation. Brenda was backed into a terrifying legal corner. To avoid serving a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary, she was forced to accept a brutal plea agreement. The terms were rigid and immediate. She had to provide full financial restitution for the $55,000 she stole in cash, and she had to personally pay off the massive penalties to instantly close the fraudulent line of credit. My parents did not have that kind of liquid capital. Their credit was completely destroyed. They had absolutely no choice but to liquidate their most prized possession. They had to put their beautiful 4-bedroom suburban home on the market. I actually drove past the property the day the real estate agent hammered the for sale sign into their pristine front lawn. I parked across the street and watched as my mother carried moving boxes out to a rented truck. She looked exhausted. Her expensive highlighted hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and her posture was completely defeated. She was losing the physical manifestation of her social status. They ended up selling the house at a slight loss to a cash buyer, just to meet the court-ordered restitution deadline. They moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, a neighborhood my mother used to actively look down upon. The loss of the house was devastating to Brenda, but the loss of her social standing was the absolute fatal blow. In the Black community, especially in the affluent church circles, my mother ran in public reputation as currency. The news of the country club disaster, the canceled wedding, the police presence and the criminal fraud charges spread through her congregation like a wildfire. Aisha attends the same church, and she gave me the play-by-play. The pastor called an emergency meeting with the church leadership board. They brought Brenda in and formally asked her to step down from all her committee positions. They told her that her actions did not reflect the values of the ministry, and that her presence was currently a distraction to the congregation. She was completely exiled from the only social hierarchy she cared about. The women who used to praise her now whispered behind her back. She was no longer the wealthy, generous matriarch raising a tech executive. She was a disgraced, convicted fraudster living in a cheap apartment. As for the golden child, the harsh reality of capitalism finally caught up to Jamal. Without our parents' suburban house to live in rent-free, and without Brenda handing him cash to fund his delusions, he was forced to enter the actual workforce. I found this out quite by accident when I sent one of my junior accountants out to the local mall to pick up some new tablets for the office. My employee came back and casually mentioned that the retail associate who sold him the electronics looked exactly like the picture of my brother I used to keep on my desk. Jamal, the self-proclaimed tech visionary and future chief executive, was now wearing a blue polo shirt and a plastic name tag, earning $14 an hour, selling extended warranties to teenagers at the mall. I had to stand on his feet all day, taking orders from a manager who was 10 years younger than him, just to make his half of the rent at the cramped apartment he now shared with our disgraced parents. The untouchable golden boy had finally been forced to touch the ground, and the impact shattered his ego completely. Every single consequence they faced was entirely earned. I did not ruin their lives. I simply stopped paying the expensive admission fee required to keep their circus running. Exactly 1 year later, the scent of roasted rosemary and garlic filled the air of my downtown penthouse. I stood in my custom chef's kitchen, pulling a perfectly glazed turkey from the double oven. This was the exact same top-floor luxury property that my mother had illegally promised to Jamal and Chloe as a rent-free wedding gift. Now it was the setting of my very first independent Thanksgiving dinner, and the atmosphere could not have been more different from the toxic holidays I endured growing up. Aisha was sitting at the massive marble island pouring generous servings of a bold vintage red wine into crystal glasses. She was laughing loudly at a joke someone had just told in the living room. I looked past the kitchen and out into my spacious living area, taking in the scene. The floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the glittering Atlanta skyline, but the real warmth was inside the room. My estate lawyer, Mr. Sterling, was sitting comfortably on my leather sofa. He had traded his usual intimidating courtroom suit for a relaxed cashmere sweater, holding a plate of appetizers and genuinely enjoying himself. He was deep in conversation with a few of my closest friends and top-tier business associates. There was no walking on eggshells. There were no passive-aggressive comments about my relationship status or my career choices. There were no hands reaching into my pockets expecting me to fund an illusion. These people gathered in my home were my chosen family. They were individuals who respected my intelligence, honored my boundaries, and celebrated my success without demanding a financial cut of it. We were not bound by shared DNA or forced obligation. We were bound by mutual respect and absolute loyalty. I thought back to the Thanksgivings of my past. I remembered my mother demanding I pay for the entire grocery bill while she took all the credit for the meal in front of her church friends. I remembered Jamal showing up 3 hours late empty-handed and fully expecting a massive plate to be served directly to him while he bragged about his non-existent business ventures. I remembered my father sitting silently in his chair, completely ignoring the heavy emotional labor I was forced to carry. That past felt like a completely different lifetime lived by a woman I hardly recognized anymore. My phone vibrated sharply against the marble countertop, pulling me out of my thoughts. I set down my oven mitts and glanced at the illuminated screen. A voicemail notification popped up. The caller identification showed a number I had permanently blocked months ago. But the automated transcript feature on my phone caught the first few lines of the audio message and displayed them on the lock screen. It was Brenda. The transcription read like a desperate, transparent script. She was talking about how the holidays are a time for grace and forgiveness. She mentioned that Jamal was having a very hard time with his retail schedule, and my father's health was stressing her out. She ended the message by claiming that a family should never let money stand in the way of God's love. She was still trying to spin the narrative. She was still trying to use religion and guilt as a master key to unlock my vault. She had learned absolutely nothing from her public humiliation or her crushing legal defeat. In the past, a message like that would have made my heart race. I would have felt that heavy, familiar weight of guilt and obligation settling deep into my chest. I would have spent the rest of the evening agonizing over whether I was being too harsh or whether I should give them one more chance. But tonight, standing in the fortress I built with my own two hands, I felt absolutely nothing for her. I did not feel a sudden spike of anger. I did not feel a lingering sense of sadness. I simply felt supreme, unbothered indifference. I unlocked my phone, swiped left on the notification, and hit delete. I confirmed the deletion, permanently erasing her voice from my device and from my life without ever listening to a single second of the audio. I dropped the phone back into my pocket, completely unaffected. I picked up my glass of wine and walked out of the kitchen, standing at the edge of the living room. I looked at the incredible people gathered in my home. I listened to the rich sound of their laughter bouncing off the high ceilings. I took a moment to fully absorb the reality of the empire I had secured. I am 36 years old today. I am entirely unmarried. I am completely childless by choice. I am independently wealthy. And for the first time in my entire life, I am absolutely unbothered. I did not just survive the financial and emotional assassination attempt my biological family orchestrated. I outsmarted them, outmaneuvered them, and outgrew them completely. I raised my glass, taking a slow, savory sip of wine, and silently toasted to the beautiful, peaceful life I defended. Blood makes you related, but loyalty and respect make you family. Never let anyone treat you like a vendor in the business of their life. If you have ever had to cut off toxic family to protect your peace, let me know in the comments. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories of setting boundaries and reclaiming your power. The most profound takeaway from this journey is that your worth is never defined by the conditional love or demands of your biological relatives. Blood may make you related, but it does not entitle anyone to exploit your success, drain your resources, or disrespect your boundaries. True family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and genuine support, not manipulation and financial abuse. Walking away from a toxic environment is not an act of selfishness. It is a necessary act of self-preservation. You have the absolute right to protect your peace, reclaim your power, and build a chosen family that celebrates you exactly as you are. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace and build your own chosen family, share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more empowering content.